Thank you.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to be here.
Now, the format of the event is going to be some questions from me to start and then a Q&A with the audience, if you're happy with that.
Sounds good.
Wonderful. So my first question is about your life as a businesswoman and your company, Ebonylife TV. So it's been extraordinarily successful. It's been the highest ranked talk show for 9 years in Africa. It's aired in no fewer than 49 countries in Africa. I'm wondering, what are the challenges that face your company, and indeed other networks, that need to compete in a world in which the opinions of our generation are increasingly being formed online and on social media rather than on television?
Thank you. It's great to be here, by the way. Thank you all so much for inviting me to share this afternoon with you. For me, I believe that deep down in my subconsciousness has always been the need to tell the African story. So it's a commercial venture, but it's also a social venture for me. So for me, I don't see the divide between work and play. So my staff get emails from me at 3 o'clock in the morning and think I'm absolutely crazy. But you know, so the journey started for me officially, I would say, about 10 years ago. But I would say that it's been a much, much longer journey than that. Now, I was born in England. I was born at a place called Hammersmith Hospital. Went back to Nigeria at age 7, came back to the UK at age 11. But between age 0 and 7 and 11 to whenever it was that I spent the rest of my life here before I went back as a married woman, you find that you do get asked really interesting questions by non-Africans. You know, they will ask you if you live in a hut. They will ask you if you live under a bridge. They will ask you if you speak African, but there is no such language as African. Africa is a continent with millions of different languages. And I found that my children, years and years later, came back to the United Kingdom, you know, to school. My son went to Harrow, my daughter went to Malvern, and they were being asked similar questions 20 or 30 years later. And therefore, I felt it was time. I was really afraid, because I was working in ExxonMobil as head of human resources, to say that it was time to take the plunge and put aside administrative work and really start to tell this journey, you know, start this journey of telling the African story. I have no media experience up until that point. I'd never been trained in media. So the first thing I did was to obviously go on a training course and learn how to speak hello and good morning or good afternoon and welcome to Moments with Mo and whatever it is that one has to say. So for me, the journey started pretty much from those sort of baby steps to getting out there and sharing the story. So yes, it did become a commercial venture, because I think sometimes when you're filling a gap that is so needed, then you find the commerce of that business starts to make absolute sense to what it is that you're doing. I was able to go out and speak to advertisers and speak to sponsors and convince them that there was a need for us to start sharing our stories, successful stories, sometimes stories that were not necessarily about some of the great things happening, but women. It could be an issue of domestic violence, of a woman that's overcome the violence. It could be fashion, it could be music, it could be great things also. So the reason for our being was really to start showcasing some of the great things that were happening across the continent and to shed light and balance on some of those other issues that was getting absolutely no airtime at all. So in that regard, it started to make commercial sense to me as an entrepreneur, and we're able to take advantage of that and build upon that success year after year. You know, Moments with Mo has probably recorded over 2 or 3, no, over 800 you know, episodes in that time period. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. So it's been incredibly successful in that regard.
Yes, but
discussing the format, though, of how you communicate with the entirety of the continent, it's television-based.
It's television-based.
Would you ever look at perhaps moving into different formats? And do you feel as if there's more of a demand for different formats, particularly from perhaps a younger audience?
Absolutely.
Despite, of course, your incredible success in television.
Absolutely. And I have to say that, you know, maybe not from day one, but I think from the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, we have moved into sort of ensuring that you can watch Ebonylife TV, Moments with Mo, on different formats. So there's television, obviously you can go on YouTube, we have Instagram, we've got Facebook, we're Twitter. I mean, they're all those, we take advantage of every single medium that there is out there so that we can reach our audiences all over the world. I mean, Ebonylife TV 2 years ago launched its own video on demand platform. So for a small amount, you can go online and pay, I think it's $5 a month, and you can obviously have access to Ebonylife TV wherever you are in the world. And we're partnering with numbers of OTT platforms to ensure that we can obviously get Ebonylife TV to you wherever you are. At this point in time, in the UK, in Canada, as I was mentioning to you earlier, we're now in the Caribbean. We're going off to the United States soon. Technically, that's all being checked. So for us, it's really about ensuring that we can get the channel to every single corner of the world, whereby there are Africans or those that may have an interest in understanding what's happening in Africa today. One of the questions I get asked often when they look at our content and our material is this made in Africa? Was this made in Nigeria? And often, I'm never sure whether to take it as a compliment or as an insult, because does that mean that we cannot make premium quality programming to come out of Nigeria? But I tend to take it as a compliment, sort of comparing our work to global standards that you would find in our industry anywhere. Absolutely. So yes, it's important for us to make sure we can share our content on as many platforms as possible. But as far as Moments with Mo goes, really, I do less and less of that. Ebonylife TV is targeted at those aged 18 to 34. I turned 51 a couple of months ago. I don't think everybody wants to sit there and look at me every other day. So I'd rather put a younger, talent out there for our audiences to be able to sort of form more of a rapport with. And I think that's really has been also very successful in that it's important to know when it's time to sort of step back and let others move forward. And we have amazing talent on the channel, and I'm very pleased with all our presenters and our actors and musicians and everyone that does everything for us, really. They've done a massive, great job. Yeah.
Picking up that theme of the content and the topics you discussed, you mentioned some of the diverse, different social issues you might discuss through the network. You yourself have been named as one of the most powerful figures in global TV. Do you feel, both as a talk show host and also as a businesswoman, a sense of responsibility to use that special position to promote certain causes or opinions?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think the number one cause that I would promote is obviously going to be empowering women. It's something that I'm very passionate about. And I think there aren't enough women in the media. There aren't enough women doing anything, period. So I will use Ebonylife TV to promote issues concerning women. I'm not saying we're going to leave the men out, but I think that, for us, I think there is more of an emphasis on empowering women and obviously youth across the continent, which forms 60% of Africa's population. So on the one hand, it's to empower women, it's also to empower youth and entrepreneurship, which is key to growing the continent as well. Absolutely.
Wonderful. You mentioned that one of the founding reasons for the network was to change the perception of Africa. You spoke in the past about the outdated modes of perception of the continent. How far do you think you've come in the last 9 years at challenging that perception? And are there different ways that perhaps you could think about furthering that cause? Your network's been incredibly successful. Have you in the past advised governments perhaps on how to manage their media, their PR? Or is that a space into which you might move?
Governments are tricky across the continent of Africa. Because sometimes governments are there today and they're not really there tomorrow. So it's for me, I'm very careful about the sort of work that we do with governments. And no matter the work we do with governments, it's important for us to remain objective about the work that we do. But I'll say in terms of those that we can work with, I think it's important. Government is a stakeholder. If we look at what's happened in the media space in the UK or in the United States or any part of the world really, you can see the influence of government and the impact they've had in developing the media and entertainment sector. So my brief to any government is that how do we create jobs? How do we create a creative economy that works? We've seen the impacts that it's had and the contributions that it's made in the United States to their GDP. So how are we going to use this across the continent to ensure that we can grow those that need to be grown from. And when you look at the media and entertainment, it's massive. It's not just film. It's film, it's television, it's radio, it's magazine, it's fashion, it's all of that. So it's to say that how can we empower our youth by looking at all of those subdivisions that make up the media and entertainment space. So yes, I would like to engage government in that regard, not for them to use it necessarily as a platform for political campaigning, but in terms of whichever government is in power must ensure that they do their quota in ensuring that we can empower and create jobs and further the cause of ensuring that we can ensure that our youth and our women and everyone generally understands how this has worked globally and how can we ensure that it has an impact across our continent.
It's interesting that you mentioned the continent at large, as well as talking about the economic benefits of a change in media perception. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion about the possibility of having a two-speed continent, of having countries like Nigeria, which are some of the fastest developing economies in the world, and then you've also got, say, South Africa and some other nations which aren't developing nearly as quickly. What are your thoughts on this concept of the two-speed Africa, and how will that affect your purpose of changing the image of Africa as an entire continent?
I think I look at Africa, and I always say that I refer to Africa as the opportunity brand. And it's really about, do you see challenge sometimes, or do you see opportunity? And I always encourage anyone around me, and my mindset also is to see the continent as a continent of opportunity. If I decided that I wanted to possibly launch Ebonylife TV from the United Kingdom, there may not be a need because there are so many TV channels in existence already. Getting the funding in place, getting the support in place could be harder. But if you look across the continent, you find the opportunities are there for you to do so much more. So I would encourage that it's important for us to spend our energy and our focus on seeing how we can build those economies into becoming first world economies. Yes, South Africa is more advanced than the rest of Africa, but it's not to say that there aren't opportunities that exist within South Africa, or it's not to say that they don't have challenges that can become opportunities. So in that regard, I really do believe that there is a lot of scope for development across the continent, and we just haven't taken advantage of it. And that's why it remains very much an emerging, but very much a growing, continent for the opportunities that continue to exist there.
Interesting. Going back to a former comment you made about your background and your time in the UK, you're talking to a room of mostly university students. Perhaps a lot of you don't know what you want to do after university. I have no idea what I want to do.
You don't?
No, not yet. And it's quite terrifying to think that in a year's time, perhaps I'm going to be out in the real world, and perhaps some of you will be too, having to know what to do. How is it that you knew that you wanted to go into human resources, and how did you go about that momentous shift from a human resources background to being one of the globe's most renowned media personalities?
The thing is that growing up, you don't really know. You just find sometimes that you stumble into certain things. And once you've stumbled upon something, you sort of stay the course. I can't say that when I was 25, I really knew what I really wanted to do. But that's not to say you mustn't do anything. You must do something that you enjoy, that you find purpose doing. But that's not to say that should be the thing you do for life. I have noticed across the continent, especially amongst my peers, that it's difficult for them to shift ground. Once they have found themselves doing something, so let's say, for example, you manage to just stumble across a job in a bank, most people are going to spend their entire lives working in that bank. Even if their mind is saying to them, there is something else I think I should be doing, most often they're not going to listen to what their mind is telling them to do, because it's just too much of a risk to venture out into the unknown. So most people, once they have found their comfort zone, they're going to stay within their comfort zone. But it's to say that, is that all there is? Are you ready to take the risk and to say, I want to move on to do other things? So for me, pretty much, my life has been a number of different chapters of having done so many different things, and some people are risk takers and they're happy to take the risk, and some people just aren't. They just want to do the norm and just continue doing the norm until they get a retirement check and call it a day. So in that regard, did I really know what I wanted to do at 25? I knew I wanted to change the world, but I wasn't sure how I was going to do that. So the first thing for me was I stumbled into recruitment, human resource management, and I sort of stayed the course. And then the natural thing was to go back and get a job doing that thing. So when I got back to Nigeria, when I was with my husband and my daughter, at the time my son wasn't born, the thing was get a job doing what you've been trained to do. And then I got a job at Mogul as head of human resources. And I did that for nearly 10 years. But something kept edging me, saying, is this really what you want to do? And when I actually resigned, everybody thought I was absolutely crazy that you have this high-paying job, hiring and firing and doing all of this, and you want to give it up? And I said, yes, I do. And then I handed in my resignation, and I just left. Of course, you're afraid of the unknown. But the thing is that, I don't know, you only live this life once, right? So go out there and do the things that you need to do. So pretty much for me, I left. It's not to say that I didn't have a plan of what I wanted to do. You know, I did. And then I went out there and then I set up Vic Lawrence and Associates, which is a HR consulting practice. I felt that what I was doing within ExxonMobil, I wanted to offer the service to a much wider community. And I saw, again, a white gap in Nigeria for this sort of business. And I took that leap of faith and I went out and I set up my own consulting practice, which still runs today. It's one of the leading HR consulting practices in Nigeria. We provide services to mainly the financial institutions across the continent. And that's going very well. I don't run it on a day-to-day basis. I tend to have a habit of starting things and finding those that can run with it, and then I pretty much move on. So halfway through running, Vic Lawrence and Associates, and we offered training courses to a lot of our clients, I found that we didn't have purpose-built training and conference facilities. So that's where the birth of a hotel project that I got involved in called the Protea Hotel came about. It's a purpose-built training and conference facility in Lagos that provides, all sorts of services, large training rooms, smaller training rooms, retreats, weekend retreats, and all sorts of things like that. People come there and companies come and have their board meetings and things like that there. So that was the next thing that I did. And then I decided that it was time to put that aside and face the world of media. And then I woke up one day and said that I wanted to start a talk show. As I said, no experience. Everybody thought I was crazy again. And then that talk show journey started. But 6-7 years into doing the talk show, I felt it was important not to only have a talk show, but also to control to a certain extent where the talk show was going to be and to have more influence in the media space. Then came Ebonylife Television and everything else that, and we started from ground zero. Ebonylife TV had nothing except an idea, and it was about taking that idea from, yes, we would like to do a channel that changes the narrative, that has premium quality programming, that can speak to those aged 18 to 34. Let's get that moving. And that's where that journey began.
On the topic of Moments of Mo, you've had the opportunity to interview some of the world's most influential and interesting people. One person you have interviewed who is particularly relevant at the moment is Hillary Clinton.
Absolutely.
My final question, I suppose, before I throw it open to the floor, what are your thoughts on 2016 and in particular of any impact that the result of the presidential election will have on Africa?
I hope she wins because I think that it makes a bold statement in the support of women. And I think it's time, for the world to understand that the world's largest nation can have a woman in charge of things. And I think it sends a strong message to the rest of the world. So she has and I would have interviewed a president of America, wouldn't I? So the United States of America. So yeah, she's got my vote. If I was an American, I'd be voting for her. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Are there any questions from the audience for Mrs. Abudu? Yes, in the second row. There's a microphone that will be passed around by Harrison.
You mentioned Africa as an opportunity continent. What do you think are the key things that need to happen for Africa to realize that full potential?
Okay. I think one of the key things is going to be leadership. I think it's about, there are 53 countries. I think it's about leadership. And I think it's about not just having a strategy, but having the ability to strategize and to execute. I think sometimes where we fall short is in execution. We have great planners. Africans, we plan, but how do we go from planning to executing? And I think that's where the shortfall is. And I think it's about some of our leaders having having a conscience and understanding that they are there to lead. And I think that's, if there's a challenge that we face, those are some of the challenges that we need to overcome.
Any other questions? Other question from the audience? Yes, please, in the front row.
Good afternoon, Mo.
afternoon.
Nice to speak to you. The question I've got is, you've spoken a lot about how you transition from kind of role to role or like profession to profession.
Mm-hmm.
And you spoke briefly about how a lot of people kind of said to you that, you know, that was a crazy move.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is, to what extent did you have people around you trying to like plug negativity into your situation or try and throw doubt over what you were doing?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I ask that is because myself and Edward, who sat next to me, we're in the middle of setting up a charity.
Okay.
And I know that you do some charity work as
Yeah.
well. And one of the issues that we're facing is that quite a few people around us are trying to, you know, throw doubt into the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the time it's people that you have respect for. So to what extent do you kind of take on board what's being said to you, but then still, you know, follow
Move
what it
ahead.
is that you're trying to
Yes.
do and what you know that kind of, you know, God's laid on your heart?
Absolutely. And I'm very pleased that you mentioned the word God. I mean, for those that are non-Christians here, I do apologize, but I don't apologize for being a Christian. If I look at my life and I look at all the journeys I've taken, I do believe that God, I have always put God at the center of everything that I have done. And often people ask me that, you know, what's made you successful, you know, and I always say that it's not about me being successful. It's really about the glory of God in my life. And I truly believe that everything that I have, everything that I have today, that I will have in the future, it's purely by His grace. That's number one. But to go back to your question about some of the people you respect saying to you, don't do this or don't do that, listen. One thing I have learned to do is to listen to everyone. Listen to the dream makers and listen to the dream killers, as I call them. Because you're going to find quite a bit of feedback that's going to help you from even the dream killers, because they may be making sense. It's going to help you go back and reassess certain things. Sometimes people that are not, they don't want to help, but unknowingly they're helping you. I have had people that have helped me without knowing they've helped me. They're actually thinking that they're digging something into your coffin, but meanwhile they're actually helping you to become bigger than you are. So it's important to take on board every single thing that everybody says to you and sit back and say, okay, can I do it this way? Can I do it that way? And use that advice to help you develop your plan, even to ensure that you can have an even stronger plan that you can execute. So don't ignore anything that's being said to you. But if you are a Christian, you're going to find, I find as a Christian, that God sends me all sorts of signs and says to me, you're going to, I mean, when I look at the people that have helped me, most of them have been absolute strangers. And I find that if someone's going to help me, God is going to plant from nowhere somebody there to help me achieve that particular dream. That for me is a sign that He wants me to take another step in the right direction. So listen, be very aware of everything that's going on around you, and just see the different steps that you're going to be taking and those that are coming into your space and that are helping you take another step further in the right direction. And sometimes you're going to take a step back. I've had so much disappointment at times that I'm like, should I really be doing this? And then sometimes from that disappointment just comes something else that's even bigger and greater than that. Then you know that you've taken one step back, but 10 steps forward. So believe in your heart and believe in yourself that you can do this. You're going to have to believe in you that you can make those things happen. Because if you don't believe in them, everyone else around you is going to be absolutely lost on it. So, you know, just make sure that you just keep the flag flying and just stay strong and stay prayerful. Yeah.
Yes, there are questions from the audience. The man on the aisle at the very back.
I'm curious to hear what you think the future of education in Africa is. Have you covered it, especially because your target audience is so young? Do you think that public education can...
Do I think that...
Do you think that public education is possible in Africa, or do you think that the growth of private education, especially really cheap private education in Africa, is an ultimate target?
Okay. I think it's going to be a mix of both. I think we have a number of private schools that work. We also have a number of public, and when I mean public, I mean government-funded schools that also work. And we have a number of schools that don't work, period. So I really think that education is something that needs to be addressed. It is being addressed, but I think that there isn't enough being done in that, in the area of education. So I think that we need to do more. But don't forget that Nigeria alone is a country of 150 million people. And we're churning out millions of graduates every year. We're turning out millions of those that are going to secondary school every year. So the numbers, we may have numbers that aren't being educated, but we also have a large number that are being educated at the same time. And the thing about a country like Nigeria is that no matter what, the numbers are there to ensure that we're never going to have a deficit of any sort when it comes to numbers being educated. That's not to say that everyone shouldn't be educated, but there are a huge number that are being educated. I think we probably have some of the most brilliant people, in the world in Nigeria. Absolutely, yeah, we do.
The gentleman 3 rows or so from the back on the left.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, my name is Justice. First, I wanted to thank you very much for coming and taking your time to speak to us today. I wanted to ask you to elaborate on your conceptualization of the African narrative, particularly because, as an African diasporan and someone who was born in Nigeria but came here when I was 10 months old, and we tend to find that when we do go back, we're not necessarily considered African in the same light as those who have domestically experienced it. And as the African narrative is something that you're trying to essentially propagate across the world and boost that story, from your experience, what would you consider the African narrative to be, and how broad would you see that? And then the second question as well, when you did move to Africa, as in permanently relocate, was there any culture shocks that you had to kind of engage with, and how did you go about engaging with that and turning that into a productive, let's say, experience?
Okay, let me take your last question first. I went back to Nigeria for the first time when I was age 7. And prior to that, I had never ever been to Africa. I'd never been to Nigeria. Let's be specific. Africa is a massive place. I'd never been to Nigeria before then. I didn't want to go back because the images that I knew of Africa, what I'd been told, was just not what I wanted to see or be a part of. And I remember going back then, I think it was 1970 or 1971. I was about 7 then. And we went by ship, because in those days, not many people used to go by air. So we went by ship. It was a 2-week journey, getting back to Nigeria. And I remember getting to Apapa Wharf, which is the wharf that, if you're coming in, that's where you go to. And, my grandparents were there and all my family were there to meet me. And I'd never met them. And anyone that came within an inch near me, I was like, get away from me. Who are you? So that shows you the mindset that I had as an African, as a Nigerian, having never been to the continent, and my skin is black. So that was my very first experience landing in Nigeria, as in, stay away from me. Mom, don't let them touch me. That was how I felt. But I found that within a very short time of being home, the love that was extended to me gave me a certain amount of comfort that, and as a child, children can adapt very quickly to any situation they find themselves in. I think within a matter of weeks, I was fine because there was so much love and affection that I felt so at home that I didn't have a problem at all. And I obviously learned to speak the local language. Well, my language is Yoruba. I learned to speak that because if you can't, it can create barriers. It can create barriers. If you go back and you cannot, and even if you can't speak Pidgin English, it can create certain barriers. It's like I was in France last week at MIPCOM, which is the biggest TV event globally. And even in France, if you can't speak French, nobody wants to know. So you find it's not just a thing in Africa, it's globally. If you can't sort of speak the language of the place that you're in, it can create a barrier. So that it doesn't help if you can't speak the language. I also think at times that, again, when I went back in my 20s, having schooled here, and you go back to Lagos thinking, oh, you're going to sort of tell everybody else, or press everybody, so to speak, as a youngster, with your latest collection of fashion and everything else. You get to Lagos and you can't oppress anyone there because the people there are not waiting for you to be, they're not waiting to be oppressed. I found that my wardrobe wasn't even half as decent as those who had never traveled. So you'd be amazed what people pick up, on the internet or what they pick up from television and from media with regards to how far ahead they are. So I think sometimes the friction is created by how we relate to those back in Nigeria. And I want to say that if anybody is here and you are from Africa or Nigeria and you're going back, please go back with your arms open. Even as an expatriate, if you're going to Nigeria or any part of the continent, just try and be more open without having a sense of, I'm better than you, because sometimes they sense that they feel that we think we're better than them because they haven't had the chances or the opportunities that we have had. So I think it's important to take that on board. But with regards to changing the narrative for me, it's about showing the world that Africans have become global citizens. It's about understanding that when you see an African woman, there's more to her than possibly having a child slung on her back and she lives in some village that has no water or has no electricity. Women are educated, they're highly intelligent. Women are running businesses that are running into billions of dollars in Africa. They're traveled, they're exposed, and often the world does not see this. So changing the narrative is about understanding that there is a new Africa, there is the other side of the coin, that for the longest time, Western media doesn't have an interest in showing the world because it's not interesting, you see, to come to Africa and show Mo wearing a pair of Chanel shoes. It's better to show Mo wearing no shoes. So, and that's what the media does, because I'm in that industry. It depends on how you want to spin the story. So our spin is to show the other side. It's to show the other alternative that exists. And that's the narrative that we want to be a part of, to encourage people like you to come back.
Can I take the lady about 3 rows from the back?
Can I have a fun question? We're all so serious.
It's Oxford.
Oh, I think mine's quite serious. Sorry.
Oh, it is? Okay. Oh, my
I
God.
was going to ask you, how do you think, as an African businesswoman, the discrimination that you might have been subjected to as a woman, how is it compared internationally versus within Nigeria? Has they been very different or same?
In terms of being a woman and the discrimination that I face? Well, the thing is that as a black woman, you face this discrimination being a woman, right? Then you face discrimination being a black woman, right? Then you face discrimination being an African woman. So at each point in time, I'm dealing with 3 sets of discrimination by some. But I won't let that get in my way. I'm just not going to let discrimination get in my way at all. If I go here, this door's blocked, I move to the next door. And that's my approach. I just refuse to see discrimination get me down. So I think each person has to make the conscious effort to say to themselves, am I going to let this get me down? Is this going to stop me from achieving my dreams and what I want to do and what I want to become? And my answer is, no, you're not going to get in my way. So I just move on. I tend not to see it. I tend not to see discrimination. All I tend to see is I'm obsessed with what it is I want to achieve and how am I going to achieve it? And that is what occupies my mind more than anything else. So, and those who want to discriminate against me, I can either be very aggressive towards them or I can just move on and look for someone else who can help me achieve my dreams, period.
The gentleman on the very edge. Gerald.
Hi. So I know in your career you've met and interviewed so many people. I'd like to know, first of all, who is the most interesting person you've met or interviewed? And who have you found the most disappointing? I know that might be a bit difficult.
You expect me to answer that, Gerald? The most disappointing, I can't say that I have found anyone disappointing. Of course, you hope that sometimes you want to get more out of the person you're interviewing than that they will give you. But I have found that I have learned so much from all the different interviews that I have done. And it's like, when you ask me what's my favorite interview, it's like saying, do I have a favorite child? No, I don't. I have enjoyed all my interviews. Obviously, some of them have been more exciting than others for various reasons. And in some instances, I'm actually scared absolutely to bits. With some of them, when I was going to do the Hillary Clinton interview, I was like, oh my God, am I going to be able to get through this? I was really, really nervous about doing the interview. Christian Lagarde, I was nervous. I've done so many of our presidents in Africa, President Jonathan, President Buhari, the current president, the president of Ghana, F.W. de Klerk was another interesting interview talking about apartheid and the impact that it had, on South Africa and things like that. When I went to New York and I interviewed DVF, Diane von Vosterberg, that created the wrap dress. There have been so many, and I've done so many interviews with ordinary people that have extraordinary stories to share that I can't sit here and say which one has not been exciting or which one has been my favorite. I've enjoyed, because I do a lot of research before I do my interviews. So before I actually decide to do them, the research would have led me to the fact that I know that there's something that's going to come out of those interviews. And we have a great research team. So Gerard, I can't answer that question, I'm sorry. Yeah.
The gentleman, a couple of rows behind, Gerald, on the edge.
Sorry, don't know if
Hi.
you can see me from here. Thank you for coming down. I've got a few questions. Unfortunately, they're not fun, but...
Okay.
So the first one is, in terms of, you mentioned earlier, which I thought was really interesting, how you've moved like a section or subsidiary of Ebonylife TV to the Caribbean. I'm from the Caribbean myself, so I thought that was quite interesting. So in terms of, you've worked a lot in Africa on the continent in terms of the narrative there. Are you intending to do anything with like your streams in the Caribbean to sort of promote awareness and empower the youth in the Caribbean as well? Do you have like a similar sort of thing going on there?
Okay.
And secondly, just a different question. You've mentioned how working with governments is a bit difficult on the continent in terms of, the instability and things you mentioned. Something that I find interesting was because Ebonylife TV, from what I've gathered, has got quite a large platform and is looking at the next generation of youth in Africa who will then become the new leaders. How do you think we can combat sort of like the fact that Africa is being used as like a war? It's like a geopolitic like war. So you've got the West who sort of play around with the governments, put in puppet leaders, sort of things there. And you've got like now China who give money to governments and they're not really telling them, oh, you need to be doing this, or we want to see democracy or whatever that means. But it's sort of not really helping to stop corruption and other sort of governments in places in Africa which are not really helping the people, but they're sort of, only really interested in their own gain. So are you going to use your platform to sort of let the youth know what we need to do in the future to sort of get out of this sort of post-colonial slavery in that way?
Okay. Going back to your first question about the Caribbean and the impact and the things that we would like to do there. For me, I'm very realistic about the plans that I make and the dreams and aspirations that we have as a channel. And, we say Ebonylife TV is Africa's first global Black entertainment network. And there was a lot of research that went into, an analysis that went into saying global Black, because we truly believe that there's a global Black audience that exists all over the world. And our primary audience is speaking to that global Black audience. So it's not just an African audience. We are made in Africa, but we are a global Black channel. And global Black for us means that so long as you're Black, and we say in quotes, happening, we want to be able to see how we can tie in your aspirations, your dreams, your hopes, your desires, objectives, etc., into everything that we do at Ebonylife Television. So in that regard, yes. For example, I'm speaking to a travel agent, a large travel agency at the moment, about taking one of our shows called The Spot to the Caribbean, whereby we can actually go on location and shoot a number of episodes in the Caribbean and things like that. So the more we're able to spread our wings, the more we can do certain things that are going to be specific to certain parts of the globe where there are where we have a global Black audience. But we are still, primarily, I think we're going to be operating out of Nigeria because we can't do everything. Last week I was at MIPCOM, which is, as I said, the largest TV event globally. And I'm having a number of ongoing discussions with some of the large, media owners, like Viacom, Discovery, who tend to own, networks. Because Ebonylife TV, we started from ground zero. But in order for us to scale, it's important for me to say, how can we make this channel grow? And it's going to only be by partnering with some of those bigger, platforms and saying, okay, can we be partly acquired so that we can obviously ensure that we have more resources to fulfill our objectives? But as I am at the moment, I think pretty much we're limited, but that's not to say we aren't going to grow. We're just going into our 3rd year. So I'm hoping and praying and working hard at the fact that there's definitely a lot more content that needs to be made to feed a global Black audience that isn't currently being fed. And I think we're realizing more and more from those that are approaching us and saying, can we have your platform? Can we have your channel on our platform? It's showing that no matter how niche a market is, it can't be ignored anymore. Everybody wants to feed and ensure that their platform can take on whoever it is. I mean, Virgin Media, we approached a couple of years ago, and now they're back saying, we want you now, come. Because obviously they have audiences that want to watch content such as what we have. And to your second question was about, sorry, you need to.
Oh, yeah, so it was quite a long one.
Yeah, it was. just jog my memory a sec for a second.
It's like, I think the continent and as well as the Caribbean is sort of being used in that.
Okay, the colonial, yeah. Yes, that goes back to the question about leadership. It's really about ensuring that we have the right leaders leading us. Because once we have the right leaders leading us, they're going to know what's best for the continent. But for as long as we vote for the wrong leader, or we don't vote at all, if you look at the last elections in Nigeria, it's the first time ever that a party that's been in power for that long has been unseated. And social media and youth had a lot to do with that. So I think we can see that there is change and change is happening. And if the current government that are there now don't do anything, they're going to see, again, what's going to happen to them. So I think people have now realized the power of their vote, the power of social media, and all of that's going to go a long way in changing how things are being done across the continent. So for me, I'm really pleased about the fact that we're starting to use every single medium at our disposal to ensure we have the right leaders. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And Ebonylife TV, in Nigeria's last elections, we interviewed President Buhari, we interviewed then President Jonathan, we interviewed the governors. We're not a political channel, but it was important that our audiences understand who they're voting for. And that's why we decided to sort of stretch ourselves a little bit into that arena.
The lady at the very back of the room.
Oh, can I just stand? I'll just stand up. As a Nigerian who watches your channel, it's quite nice to have a channel made by Africans for Africa. And my question is about sort of when you're talking about the representations of Africa in the media, I find, at least amongst Africans, that it seems like Nigeria tends to control and tends to dominate everything. So I'll give examples. There'll be like a song like, "We love Africa." There'll be 5 Nigerians and 3 Ghanaians and like 1 token Zimbabwean or something. Or even a show on your channel, for example, it's called Desperate Housewives Africa. But it has all Nigerian actors and things like that. So I was wondering, sort of, is the representation of other African countries something that is particularly important to you? Because I can say it's very categorical, growing up in Africa. Even though I grew up in Africa, I didn't know anything about other countries in Africa. We're very, I call it the Nigeria bubble. Because we have so much to talk about already within us, we don't really tend to reach out and involve ourselves with the other countries. So I was wondering, on your channel, are you going to be, how are you going to sort of get talents from other countries in Africa and tell their stories? Is that something that's important to you?
Yes.
And how are you going to do that?
Thank you. Very good question. Sometimes, it can, don't forget that Nigeria is a big country. 150 million or 170 million people. Lagos has over 20 million people in it. South Africa has a total population of, I think, 40 million. So when you look at one state in Nigeria versus the other 36 states, is half of South Africa. So whenever we talk about Africa, Nigeria is always going to be rather prominent because of sheer size. So that in itself is going to impact whatever you see, be it a music video and they say Africa, and you see 5 Nigerians and 2 Zimbabweans, because Zimbabwe only has what population, I don't know, maybe what's the population of Zimbabwe. So I think that also has something to do with it. But to go back to the role that we're going to play with regards to ensuring that we are a Pan-African channel, yes, we do broadcast to a Pan-African audience. And Desperate Housewives actually had a Kenyan lady in it as well. Now, when we did auditions, you know, the economics of the business also, to a certain extent, does influence some of the things that we do. So, for example, we were not able to have auditions all over the continent, but we had an online audition where we said, wherever you are in the world, send us your audition tape. Everything was online for Desperate Housewives, and we will audition you online. And sometimes it's the responses that we get. We can only go from the responses we get. So I don't think that we had a huge influx of other Africans wanting to be in the show. Hence us obviously coming up with more of a Nigerian cast, and obviously we had a Kenyan who plays a major role in that show. But there are 2 shows in development at the moment that I think is more Pan-African. Moments with Mo that I started 9 years ago now has an offshoot called Moments, because the Mo isn't there, so why keep calling it Moments with Mo? So the new show is called Moments, and now we have Moments South Africa, Moments Ghana, Moments Kenya, and Moments Nigeria. And what's happening in each of those countries is that we have actually engaged local talent. So we have 2 presenters or hosts running the shows in Nigeria, 3 in Nigeria, 2 in South Africa, 2 in Kenya, 2 in Ghana, and they have their own guests coming on the show, talking about their own realities. And again, it's Pan-African, so you get to see what's happening in South Africa once a week, what's happening in Kenya once a week, Ghana, etc. And I'm hoping that we can grow that. But it's only the economics of finding sponsors that's going to take us to other countries so that we can have Moments Zimbabwe, Moments, whatever, Mozambique, and so on and so forth. And another show that we're doing that's going to be quite interesting, that's going to launch from January, is called Destinations Africa. And in that series, for year 1, we've gone to 12 African countries. Year 2, we're doing another 10 African countries. And the show has a sponsor called Wakanao, that's one of the larger travel agencies in Nigeria. And what they're doing is we're going to these countries and we're showcasing the beauty of each of those countries. They're 30 minutes sort of travel shows, so you get to see a little bit of the nightlife, a bit of tourism, a bit of business activity, fashion, music, the whole thing rolled into one. So again, that's taken us to a Pan-African audience. So, we're just a 3-year-old channel doing the best we can to ensure that we can meet the needs of a Pan-African audience and a global Black audience as well, which is why I'm saying it's important for us to scale so that we can really, really do more across the continent, which is our wish.
We have time for a final few questions. The lady about 3 rows from the front.
Hi Mo, thanks for everything you've shared with us today. My question is, I'm from South Africa.
Okay.
And like you mentioned, South Africa obviously faces very different challenges to Nigeria, to Kenya, to everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I think the message that Africa has been consistently lately sending out, and rightfully so, is that Africa is not a country. Each African country is very distinguished from the other. But at the risk of sort of losing something precious within Africa, what would you say is the one thing that does unite us all, or could unite us all as a continent, as opposed to looking at us all separately as different individual units?
Okay. I think that, when FIFA 2010, was it? I think football, it sort of unites us. Because the minute that your country is out, then you support the next African country, so to speak. So unfortunately, I don't have a football channel, but I think football unites us all. I think music and fashion unites Africa. And I think we need to play more to those things. And I think our aspirations as people unite us also. And I think, with Ebonylife TV, it's really about looking at what's the sweet spot with regards to what are those aspirations? What is fashion? What is music? What are those things that bring us together? And I think, if I'm going to focus on anything, I'm going to say this, those are some of the high, I think it's aspirations. Our aspirations, we're very aspirational as a people. And I think shows that can sort of focus on entrepreneurship, that can showcase what's happening to different women and to different entrepreneurs across the continent can definitely bring us together more. And I think also our governments have a role to play in ensuring that there can be cross-border trade. And also the airlines. Sometimes it's easier to go from London to Nigeria than it is to go from London to Kenya or whatever, because you just find that the travel routes are just not that clear sometimes. But in terms of us as a TV channel, the things that I think that can unite, I think music, I think fashion, I think our aspirations generally. I mean, whatever your aspirations are, I'm sure they're very similar to mine or to my daughter's. And I think those are the things that we need to key into together as a continent. Yeah. And do you think that, I mean, are you convinced? Do you think those are some of the things that we can work at, or?
Yeah, no, I do.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think fashion, I think music, yeah, I think aspirations. Yeah.
Good answer. The gentleman on the
And
edge.
football.
And football, of course.
Thank you for coming. You spoke earlier about the influence that sort of the perception of Africa and the portrayal of Africa had even on you as a child. And obviously, at least thinking of my own experience, a huge part of that sort of negative perception of Africa comes from charitable associations. And people think of Africa, they think of
honestly,
like Feed the Children and pictures of starving kids.
Yeah.
And obviously, it's very important to take care of people that are suffering, and there are a lot of poor people in Africa. Sort of part one of my question is, how do you think that charities and governments providing aid can, on the one hand, highlight the poverty that does exist and encourage people to help without painting the whole continent with one brush and saying, you know, everyone is sort of dying of starvation? And then sort of the second part is that obviously the aid is generally given with good intention, but many people have claimed that it's actually had a detrimental effect or a harmful effect on the development of African economies. Do you think that's true, that it's been harmful? And sort of what do you think that Western countries or individuals looking to sort of promote growth in Africa could do better in the future?
Okay, good question. I don't think everybody can do absolutely everything. I think there's different things and everyone plays a different role. I mean, I do get pretty upset at times when I turn on my television right here in London and I see, you know, some advert whereby it's like, you know, some child starving to death, and I don't even know where they find the children to make those adverts. Because how do you take a child that's really starving and shoot them and record it? It just shows you the amount of, is it acting? Is it, I mean, how do you shoot a commercial like that? You know, so for me, I have a little bit of a challenge with those types of commercials. And I think that some of those commercials should actually be censored, because I don't think they actually give you a true picture of what's going on across the continent. And if that's the only image you see on your television every day, that's what you're going to believe that Africa is. And I can't tell them to stop making those commercials. I think somebody needs to tell them that, you know, those commercials don't quite look right, you know, but that's the business they're in. They're going to keep doing them. It's not just about Africa. Sometimes it's Eastern Europe. It's all sorts of issues that you find, you know, and the thing about being in the media is that we know how to spin stories. So, you know, you're going to get someone to shoot a really great commercial about how everyone in Africa is starving, and people are going to really believe that, you know, but we can't change that. But when I interviewed Hillary Clinton, one thing I did ask her was that, how do we change this stereotype, you know, in terms of what people think of Africa? And she said, no, there needs to be more voices like yours speaking on behalf of Africa. Now, I can't do this alone. I just can't. I'm just not. I don't have capacity. I don't have the resources. But the little bits that I can do, I will continue to do. But I think there needs to be more. Because it's as if there's a massive like explosion of Africa is the poor continent by all these NGOs and these charities. So there needs to be more people like me speaking on behalf of Africa and showcasing the great things about Africa, showcasing our fashion, showcasing our designers, showcasing the great music that comes from the continent, the great art that comes, the architecture, you know, the companies that have been set up and are succeeding and are doing extremely well. No one's telling those stories. And until we start to tell them, that change isn't going to happen. So I need help, guys. If there's anyone here that, you know, wants to set up another TV channel, or we can expand together, please, let's look at that. because that's the only thing that's going to change. Until we can get onto mainstream television in the UK with programming. And I'm really pleased that our first feature film, we set up Ebonylife Films last year. We have our first feature film called 50 that's been selected to screen at the London Film Festival. This week it's going to be screening. And we showcase a Lagos like you've never seen it. Now, I didn't create that Lagos, it's there. But we chose to go and film that part of Lagos for the world to see. We chose to focus on women that had stories to tell, that are looking like me, rather than some woman in the village. I'm not saying they don't exist, but we can't keep focusing on just that one side, which has been what the Western media has done for the longest time. So I'm battling here, but it's like I can only do so much, so we need more help in that regard. Yeah.
One last question from me. I think everyone here would agree that you're incredibly eloquent, incredibly passionate about issues that really mean a lot to you. I'm curious to ask about your future. You said that Africa needs the right leadership. Mm-hmm. Perhaps could we see Mo Abudu go into politics in the next 5 to 10 years?
Woo! Well, who knows? I will be led. I will be on my knees and I'll be asking God for direction. If I think that I can, if God wants me to, and if I get the votes of those that say, Mo, do it, I will say it is something that I think maybe not just me, but more women need to be out there speaking on behalf of Africa and doing more to move the continent forward. And if come the time, come 2019 in Nigeria, and I say Mo for president, why not? If that's what God wants to happen, but I don't know, I can't say that today. But I will be led. I want to be led into doing the right things. Absolutely.
Having interviewed a number of politicians, I think the important point here is that that wasn't a no. Well, thank you so much for joining us. That's all we have time for. Mrs. Abudu is incredibly gracious and has said that she'll join us in the bar afterwards to continue the conversation with you personally. So please just, after us, follow us into the bar and we'll be able to talk further. Could you please join me in thanking Mo Abudu?
Thank you. Thank you all.